Hello, my name's Graeme Innes from Life Without Barriers, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are making this video and people are watching it, and their elders past, present and emerging. Life Without Barriers provides support to people with disabilities all around Australia. And our first strategic goal is to deliver great services. We're proud to be the gold sponsor for the ASID Virtual Expo in 2021. And we wanted to contribute to the Expo by sharing a monograph which we asked Professor Lesley Chenoweth, AO, and Professor Deliana Stellick to prepare, called Addressing an Inclusive Future for People with Disability in Australia. So my name, as I said, is Graeme Innes, and I'm Australia's former Disability Discrimination Commissioner and a board member with Life Without Barriers. And I'm talking today with Professor Lesley Chenoweth about the monograph. Lesley is an emeritus professor at Griffith University and still actively involved in disability issues. And her co-author, Professor Daniela Stellick, is also honorary professor at Griffith. So welcome, Lesley, to this conversation. How well do you think we currently embrace and protect the rights of Australians with intellectual and cognitive disabilities?
Well, thank you, Graeme, and thanks to Life Without Barriers for an opportunity to talk about the work that we undertook in the monograph. And of course, that opening question, that's a very big question. And when we began and we reflected back at what point would we start to think about, you know, how far have we come? So if we look back 30 or 40 years, of course, life for people with an intellectual disability was very, very different. It was prior to having a whole raft of different legislation and policy. So in terms of how far we've come, I think we have progressed quite a way in terms of progressing legislation, Disability Discrimination Act. We've also moved ahead in terms of policies. But I think what we have to really take into account is there are still substantial barriers to people with an intellectual disability in exercising those rights.
So before we come to those barriers, Lesley, and I want to talk about those today, but I mean, you and I would be well aware of what life was like 30 or 40 years ago for people with disabilities, but many people in the sector may not have that picture. So let's paint the picture a bit. I mean, life for most people with intellectual disabilities 40 years ago would be living in a large institution.
Indeed.
Not much contact with the outside world, unless there was, you know, maybe family visits for people who had family with whom they were still engaged, and a pretty controlled life. That's the way it was, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And in that front, you know, things have changed dramatically, but that's exactly right, Graeme. All across Australia, we had institutions that housed hundreds of people with disabilities, largely people with intellectual, developmental disabilities, but often people with other significant impairments as well. And that is very true. It was a life of being congregated, of being segregated, and it was certainly a life of exclusion, profound exclusion.
And there were so many rules and sort of arbitrary processes that went around that, weren't there? I mean, in any institution, when you eat, when you go to sleep, guided often by the needs of the staff.
Needs of the staff and needs of the institution primarily. And people had every aspect of their life, all needs were catered for under the one roof, as it were. So they, you know, you got up, you all ate together, you had things, people might have had activities through the day, but a lot of it was people just had nothing to do. And, you know, and so your health needs, everything was all under, you know, you had the institution haircuts from the institution's barber. You ate the food that everyone ate. And so it was a life of, I mean, there was very little choice, very little choice.
And if you went out, and often you didn't, but if you went out, you went on the special bus and you stayed in a group of other people with disabilities, and you were very much marked as a group of people with disabilities and segregated from the rest of the community. So what's your research and experience showing you about what inclusion actually looks like in a modern society? Let's move forward that 40 years and look at what you've learned to inform where we are at present. How have things changed?
Well, that was a really interesting exercise in the monograph, because Danny and I undertook a huge scan. We sought to find out, and this was particularly focused on what was inclusion like and what was the experience for people, largely people with intellectual disability, but people with disabilities. So we did quite a significant literature review. We actually also used our networks, and we examined a whole range of organisations, groups or movements that were essentially about promoting that. What was a good life? What did inclusion look like? There were some really common themes that came through that as to, well, what are the features? What do we have to have to really promote and support inclusion? And these were, first, that relationships are central for people to be included. Relationships for them with family, with their neighbours, with people in the community. All of these programs and movements that we looked at, their fundamental focus was on human rights. So I think that's a really key foundation for these. The next thing was that the people had choices. They may have had, you know, limited choices about some things in life, but there was a strong focus on enabling and supporting choice. There was a strong focus in all of them of how does a person have control over their own decisions. All of them too had the person at the centre for planning and how supports were provided. And finally, and this I think is key, is that community connections are vital for that to happen. So that's a whole range of, and you can, you know, think about your own experience and what's going on in the sector in Australia. And certainly a lot of that is very much a feature, a lot of person-centeredness, personalisation, an emphasis on choice, etc. But those were the key things that we found. And, you know, one's own experience over many decades would bear that out as well, that this is what we need to achieve. Yeah. Because
we haven't achieved that yet, have we? I mean, when you think about people and where most people live, which is not in institutions anymore, but it's in group homes or group accommodation with people with whom they haven't chosen to live necessarily. And they may have had some input into, but really it's sort of congregate accommodation. And there are some choices about the way those that accommodation works, but it's still quite guided by the process, isn't it? So we're still on that journey. I mean, it's improved, but we're not there yet by a long way, are we?
No. And I mean, I think you're right, Graeme. I think for many people, it's a constrained choice. Many people are still living with other people with disabilities. Sometimes that's their choice. But I think, yes, we're on a journey here. And we've still got a ways to go.
Yeah, Lesley, it's been fascinating to read the monograph and to talk with you about it. And the monograph can be obtained from the Life Without Barriers website. I'd encourage those of you watching the video to have a look at it, because we can't resolve those issues in the future unless we understand the journey that's taken place and where we've come from. So thanks for spending time with me.
Thank you so much, Graeme. And Danny and I really appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts on some of these things. Thank you.